In this video, I want to provide you with an overview of the College Career and Civic Life, or C3 framework. This framework provides the structure for all lesson plans completed in this class. The C3 framework was created in 2013 in response to the Common Core standards, as the social studies was absent from those standards. The subjects only included in the Common Core standards were language arts and math. So the social studies and science disciplines created their own independent standards to connect to them and reinforce the core ideas of their disciplines. In social studies, we came up with the C3 framework. And the aim of this framework is to help students gain the intellectual power to recognize societal problems, ask good questions and develop robust investigations into them, consider possible solutions and consequences, to separate evidence-based claims from parochial opinions, and to communicate and act upon what they learned. Now, this quote plays out in the C3 framework in the way it's structured, with the asking of good questions related to big problems by looking at evidence and determining solutions to those problems, and then making claims, making an argument in relation to the questions asked, and then to potentially take action upon a related problem in a real-world setting. So in teaching from an inquiry perspective, the teaching and learning of social studies undergoes certain shifts. These include crafting questions that spark and sustain inquiry from teachers and students, rather than having a class that is known as drill and kill or content recitation, where a teacher stands in front of the room and lectures at students, or students complete bookwork. The cultivation and nurturing of a collaborative civic space, where students can engage with students and peers and teachers and the community to solve problems. The purposeful integration of content and skills, in contrast to many social studies classrooms today, where content is the sole thing taught, rather than the necessary skills to be successful in life. It also promotes literacy practices and outcomes. Many social studies teachers do not view themselves as teaching literacy, but literacy goes beyond just reading and writing, of which you should be teaching students how to do in social studies, but also disciplinary literacy, how to think from a perspective of being an historian, an economist, a political scientist, or a geographer. And it also provides students with tangible opportunities for taking informed action. Many students will ask the question of, why do we have to do this? Why does this matter? You probably ask this question yourself of many teachers. The C3 framework has students take action upon the problems that they're studying and learning about in class, so that these investigations hold meaning for the students and their lives, and even possibly their community. So the C3 framework is divided into 4 categories. Dimension 1, developing questions and planning inquiries. So the very first important part is, what question are we answering? Not everything in the social studies fits well with a C3 framework inquiry lesson plan. Particular questions are very noticeably present in Dimension 1. Dimension 2 is applying disciplinary tools and concepts. This is divided into the 4 main categories of civics, economics, geography, and history. There are particular standards that relate to each of these disciplines, which I will show you in just a minute. You also evaluate sources and evidence. You provide students with sources to investigate, whether they are primary or secondary sources, images, text, videos. And in relation to these sources, students develop claims using that evidence. And then finally, after evaluating all the sources, they revisit their opening question, their core question, and come to some conclusion in relation to what they think about that question. And they also try to take action in relation to that question. So let's look at the standards before we get to Dimension 1. This is Dimension 2, an overview of disciplinary tools and concepts. So the 4 main areas of civics, economics, geography, and history. You'll notice that civics is divided into 3 categories. Economics, geography, and history are divided into 4. Now, when developing a lesson plan using the inquiry framework, you need to start with standards first, or the kind of question, a big problem you would like to investigate with your students that's appropriate for their grade and age. So let us look at the standards first. Here are the civics standards. You'll notice that these are different than the way that the SOLs are structured and written. The C3 standards do not have any or very few content-specific standards. There's no presence of individual names, events from the past. These standards are about broad topic ideas that students should have an understanding of by the time they graduate high school. You also do not see in the Virginia SOLs a breakdown by grade, and that's something that these standards are set apart as. So you'll see in Dimension 2 civics, so there's civic and political institutions. So for instance, we see D2, Dimension 2, civics, standard 1, K through 2. So between kindergarten and second grade, students should be able to describe the roles and responsibilities of people in authority. By third grade, and through third grade through fifth, they should be able to distinguish the responsibilities and powers of government officials at various levels and branches of government and at different times and places. And you'll see this leveling play out through all the standards. So this is the C3 framework document. You can find it online if you type in C3 framework. It opens up as a PDF. You also will be provided access to this document in Module 3 for the lesson plan when you're introduced to the lesson plan that you'll be developing using these standards. So you'll see each of these areas. So there's participation and deliberation. So for instance, students will be able to apply civic virtues when participating in school settings. Students will compare their point of view with others' perspectives. So a lot of the civics ones deal with interaction, understanding, roles, responsibilities, what is authority, what is not. So this requires students to engage with one another. You'll also see from time to time standards that don't have any presence. So for instance, this one right here doesn't begin until grade 3, where students are asked to explain how policies are developed to address public problems. So that's a little too complicated for kindergarten through second graders. So that standard doesn't start until third grade. You also see the same thing in economics. So we see economic decision making. In kindergarten, students will learn how to explain how scarcity necessitates decision making, identify the benefits and costs of making various personal decisions. And all the standards like this more broad in terms of focus more on the concepts and skills of the social studies rather than the very specific content that you might be thinking about when of history and economics and geography. So I want to step back now to Dimension 1, developing questions and planning inquiries. So questions arise from students' innate curiosity about the world and from their efforts to make sense of how that world works. A good, compelling question in the social studies does not relate specifically to an event or a person or content. You're not going to say, who was the first president of the United States? Mainly because that question can be answered just by simply looking in a textbook or a handout that you give the students. Compelling questions focus on enduring issues and concerns. They're the big problems that exist. And often that they exist for students, that they ask these questions continuously trying to understand what is life, what does this mean, what does it mean to be a good citizen, what does it mean to be in school. These are the kinds of questions that students are asking on a regular basis that you can make connections to. So a compelling question deals with the curiosities about how things work, how interpretations, application of disciplinary concepts, and the unresolved issues that require students to construct arguments in response. That means there is no easy answer to these questions. They're very open-ended in nature. And that's the big guiding question that will be at the focus of the core of your lesson plan. And then there's a series of supporting questions. Now, these supporting questions focus on descriptions, definitions, and processes. They're very easy to define. So rather than compelling questions where you're maybe asking, for instance, do we have to have rules? Students ask all the time, is everyone unique? Are all rules good rules? So those are compelling questions that students may have about broad nature ideas and that are not easily answerable. There's different answers to these questions. That contrast those compelling questions with supporting questions, such as what are some rules that families follow? That's a very definable thing. In your family, you had some rules that you had to follow when you were a child. What is culture? How is government organized? How do maps help us find what we are looking for? Those are very specific answers to those questions. So when we're differentiating between compelling and supporting questions, we have one that is broad in nature, that's complex, that's of interest, and it's everlasting. Adults still ask the questions of, do we have to have rules? Why is so-and-so special? Contrast those with the supporting questions, which have very simple, definable answers. So here's an example, and I'll provide a few slides that relate to these examples. So a compelling question, what makes holidays special? So why should we care about holidays? That's a very broad question. So the supporting questions for this would be, what are holidays and traditions? How are holidays celebrated with traditions? And what symbols make us think of certain holidays? There are specific answers to those three questions, which makes them supporting questions. As part of the inquiry framework, you'll also be introducing the lesson, through what's called a staging the question activity. So for instance, you might introduce your students to this issue of holidays by saying, in your small group, I want you to identify and describe your favorite family celebrations. For example, what are some holiday dinners? What's traditional celebrations and birthdays? Now, real quick, just so you get a sense of how this looks in a lesson plan. This is the framework you're going to use. You put your compelling question here. You'll identify Virginia Social Studies SOL from your appropriate grade, K through 5. You would input your C3 standard here. You'll have an interdisciplinary standard, science, math, or language arts there. You would put your staging the question activity, whatever it is you're having students do in this space. And then you have your supporting questions there and there. In the final lesson plan for this class, you'll be having 3 supporting questions, but for this very first lesson plan in this class, you'll have only 2 questions that I'll ask you to provide. You'll also have a series of sources and activities. So on each question, you'll have to have at least one source that you're providing. So in this instance, for example, an image bank, pictures of people celebrating holidays and traditions. And then a formative task, an activity a form of assessment that looks at the activity and the images from the featured source activity. So for instance, you had students in small groups discuss the images from the image bank and identify what the holidays were in the image bank. That could be, you might say, it's a small group discussion activity using the images. The formative assessment would be done as a whole class. For instance, brainstorming a list of holidays and traditions. So after the individual activity using images, the students would collectively brainstorm as a form of assessment to show evidence and understanding about what is a holiday and a tradition. Same thing happens for other questions. For instance, how are holidays celebrated with traditions? You would have featured sources such as teachers and students located books on holidays, so some children's literature books. And they would read them and maybe write a little bit of a synopsis about what happened. A performance task would be, like, as a group, students would construct a group T-chart that identifies various holidays and associated traditions. So you'd have a third question. So finally, after students go through 3 different questions and 3 sets of sources and formative assessments, there's a summative assessment. And in this lesson plan, you're going to develop 2 different assessments. One is an argument. So students are constructing an argument in relation to the compelling question, such as, what makes holidays special? Construct an argument. Write 1 paragraph that addresses that question. So write 1 paragraph using things you learned in these lessons about what makes holidays special. You also have an extension. So how could you develop further learning and thinking about this particular idea in the class? Now, these are not specifically linked assessments. One is individual, one should be collaborative. There's also this idea of taking informed action, where students apply things they learned in a real setting. So for instance, to show understanding, they identify traditions that have been enacted in class during the school year to that point. They assess, they decide on a tradition that students would like to begin in class, and then they act. they establish a new tradition in the classroom. So the take informed action applies things in a real world setting.